We're all mic'd up and everything. Excellent. All right. Mia Guillen, everyone.
Hi, everyone. So good to see so many familiar faces. Wait, where did Dr. Guevara? Oh, hi. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So hi, my name is Mia. This is my presentation. I studied art as a form of resistance to gender violence in Spain. This Maybe Look is actually my zine. You can feel free to pick up a copy when you're done. I thought if I'm interviewing a bunch of Spanish artists and academics and their art, I should also make some art based off of their art. So I made a, I think, cute little zine that you can pick up on your way out. And you can also follow along with it on my presentation. When you think about Spain, what are you thinking about? I'll make a guess for you. You're probably thinking about tapas, tanning, their lisp, and all of those things are right, but what you might not consider, to quote one of the ladies that I interviewed, is that the patriarchy is the patriarchy, just as it is in the US, as it is in Europe, and they hurt people just the same. So, how is gender violence resisted through art in Spain? And here are some of my pages, so again, you can kind of get walked through it. Okay. So, what did I do? I had the privilege last summer of going to Madrid with Dr. G, Dr. Gonzalez, and Kelly also. We went together, and we were studying cross-cultural psychology, but while we were there, or before we went there, I was like, what if I kind of monopolize the situation and I conduct my first ever research experiment by myself, and with his help. So I went in with ground theory. Ground theory is not as ubiquitous here in the US as it is in other countries like Europe, or continents like Europe. So it's essentially a journalistic approach. It is qualitative, not quantitative. So I'm not going in with the thesis, I'm looking for my thesis. So I'm using the wealth and the knowledge of all of these women that I'm interviewing, and I'm looking for the confounding variables back at home, using a lot of AI and a lot of coding technology softwares, and then I'm looking for my thesis that in future can become testifiable for more empirical research. So it's a little bit unique. So censorship, politics, and literacy affect every society in very similar veins, but what's really important to think about is the censorship that is traced back to Franco's dictatorship in Spain. They have a very rich historical implications, and when the regime was ended in the early 1970s, their history was essentially erased, and gender violence was just kind of dismissed and therefore normalized in society. If you watch documentaries, it's really creepy. They were literally allowed to just walk around as if nothing had happened in the dictatorship, and they were just able to live their everyday lives, which you can imagine what that does to the culture. Violence against women in all countries, but especially in Spain, therefore, has become aestheticized, glamorized, and normalized. And it's very deeply enrooted in their cultural heritage. So in interviewing these women, I was able to ask them all the same set of questions to see what their answers were as women in art and women who study art. So, since the 16th century in historical museums like the Prado, they have upheld works that objectify women and dehumanize them. So, as I said, and I was able to visit for, I think, the second time, the Prado Museum. It is one of the largest, most beautiful museums in the world. It's located right in the crux of Madrid. But they are still presenting a lot of famous works that are still depicting brutalizations of women. So again, what kind of message is that sending? So since then, however, I was able to interview some women that not only got their PhDs from the Complutense University of Madrid, but they also study there as well. And a lot of them have formed table talk conversations through the Prado. They have formed a lot of democratic discourse and exhibitions, starring and centering female artists, to have more of a democratic discourse. However, in interviewing a lot of younger artists in Madrid, I found that they viewed it as a very shallow kind of reformation and more of a pathetic attempt to dismantle the patriarchy. They didn't really see it as anything meaningful. So a lot of organizations out there in Madrid, notably MAV, which stands for Mujeres en las Artes Visuales, or Women in the Visual Arts, they established themselves in 2009 as kind of a response to what they thought was this shallow democratic reform. It was formed by a bunch of female artists and female educators because they thought the social progress was trivial and not very meaningful. They still thought it was rooted in that violent misogyny of their history. So they've gone on to establish themselves and really grow, and since then they've done a lot of important findings, including the fact that the majority of fine arts students over in Spain, 64% are women, and 76% of their art history graduates are also women. However, when they leave school and they enter the workforce, they are still being demoted to bottom of the ladder roles in museum coordinating, curation, art. So men are still being overrepresented even though they are not as prominent in that realm. So here's a prime example. Botticelli's Nostalgia degli Onesti. If you speak Italian, I'm so sorry for how I just pronounced that. This is a major piece over in the Prado. It is a 4-piece panel. It all goes together. And what is it depicting? So if you see over at the top, a woman is being pursued. She is obviously trying to escape. It doesn't work, so she ends up being brutalized and it ends up being celebrated and she is being physically harmed. Now, what kind of message does this send to young women in Spain? This is such a deep part of their history, and it's literally still being glamorized in the Prado. So all of these women that I had the pleasure of interviewing, spoke about this. So these are all of the ladies that I was able to interview and analyze their different medias and works. So who did I interview? I interviewed a plethora of artists. Some of them, when I say artists, I mean maybe a graphic designer like Carla. She's so cool. She mostly does comics. Graphic designers, professors, researchers, art curators. So these are them. Get a little bit more into detail. Materials. I had the awesome pleasure of actually getting to witness these documentaries and one-woman shows live. So her name is Maria Rivo, and she had an awesome documentary called Estado de Molestar, state of like being I don't know how to translate that into English in a way that doesn't sound really weird. So I'm gonna try. And then No Solo Duelen los Golpes, which translates to like not only physical violence hurts, which was a one-woman show in Madrid that I got to watch, and it was based off of her own past intimate abusive relationship, where she didn't realize until the end that just because it wasn't physical, it was still very violent and emotionally turbulent. And it was really empowering just to go with some of my friends from the trip as young women and get to experience that firsthand and get to analyze this piece. It was really, really powerful. The way that she was able to talk about the hypermasculinity and machismo culture and how it impacted kids and how it starts out as kids, that sort of mentality and how it's normalized. And then she did this really awesome piece. You can actually find both of these things on YouTube, and you can translate both of them with subtitles. Oops, sorry about that. And it was kind of more abstract. She interviewed herself a series of women and their responses to domestic violence, and then afterwards she moderated a very intimate, very cool Q&A session that I was able to attend. Okay, so just some more pictures just so you can kind of put faces to these names that I'm talking about. These are some of the primary questions that I asked them. What inspired them to start this work? What patterns do they see in their spaces? And then another one I thought was really interesting was, how do you think that gender violence differs in Spain from the US, perhaps? And interviewing them all individually, they all said, it's impacting us the same way as it impacts you. We're just in a different continent. However, they felt like they had to really catch up to us at first, and they thought that we're a lot more mobile and we're a lot more politically able over in the US, which I thought was really interesting. The censorship, they felt, really set them back, and a lot of their work, especially in the 70s and 80s, dealt with catching up to us. How can they catch up to the US? And they all felt that social media was a really great device for that, and has been something that has really made their work amplified and a lot more visible. So what advice would you give to young people? They felt like there's a lot of fear with young people, but that's something that is actually motivating us, which I found really interesting. And then one of the main questions, which I'll get to, is how we can better work together. And then I have a little clip. It's in Spanish, but it's basically just one of the women I interviewed from 2009, so you don't really need to understand. It's really quick. Yeah.
El Museo de Arte Carrillo Gil, un espacio para el arte de vanguardia, presenta la obra de la artista e investigadora gallega Mia Guillen.
Se trata de la exposición videográfica Words and Words, una muestra antológica de esta polémica creadora que reúne 3 videoperformances y 5 documentales que exploran temas como el cuerpo, las formas del trabajo y las diversas maneras de narrar la historia, explorando tanto la memoria como el olvido. Entre los títulos que integran esta exposición,
So basically, it said that she explores themes pertaining to the body, she explores collective memory, erasure, and censorship. And they called her controversial, which is really important to note. This kind of mentality difference between an older researcher that I interviewed that's more established, and then these younger, more feisty artists whose works are seen as controversial. So I can't click out of it. Okay, thank you. So really, this is the big picture. This is the visual model. This is the so what. This is after encoding all of my transcripts and translating them. This is what I was able to build using variables. So we start at the top and we go down. So laying the framework is the cultural memory and the historical erasure that happened in part to the regime. So these are all also quotes from my interviews that I thought correlated well. Our culture and identity need to be revolutionized. That's where we start. We drip down to collective struggle. This is the personal traumas, the activism, the personal narratives. And then someone said, her name's Asuncion, she said, you need someone to spark the light. And that was a commonality between all of the women I interviewed. They had that one person, that one mentor, that one professor that kind of opened their eyes to this entire field and made them think, so what? That's art as resistance, which is actually really contrary to these really big facilitated museums like the Prado, who have their own exhibitions. So it's kind of a contrary counterculture of reclaiming the space through their smaller grassroots do-it-yourself art. It's a bifactorial model in the middle, as institution and censorship in the state and media play a pivotal role. And then this quote is actually this is Esther Ferrera's quote. She's at the front of my zine. She said, one of the only facets of liberty is art. And I think that's one of our big takeaways here. Art is a political force. It's more than just a pretty painting or a pretty picture. So the biggest takeaways, again, when asking them, how do you think you guys can better collaborate as activists, academics, researchers, artists? And they said, we are missing cross-disciplinary intersections. We are not working together like we could and we should, and that is what's really missing. So the last part and the biggest part, the final part of my visual model is not just collaboration, but accessibility and public engagement. They said, to quote, get back to the colleges, the street, and the people. We need to be more interactive, not just work in our bubbles. And so that's kind of one of the final things that I want you to think about, because again, to go back to things like the Prado, these museums, these really fancy, really beautiful exhibitions, not everyone has those 20, 30 euros that it costs to even enter. It needs to go back to the streets, like they say. And that's kind of what I want you to leave you with, thinking about with my model, is that we don't get that much in just working in our bubbles. It's about connecting with the people around us, and also realizing that we have a lot more in common with the folks on the other side of the world than we think we do. So, final slide, future directions. I definitely would like to consider studying rural areas of Spain. I have the pleasure of being in Madrid, but it's very wealthy, it's very urban. So I would love the opportunity to find additional barriers or resources as opposed to the suburbs. For quantitative internal validity, the future study of my own or someone else's might interview more artists and academics. And then a limitation of this study was definitely the brevity of time that I was in Madrid. I was there for a month, but a month for doing research goes by a lot quicker than you think. So that is it. Thank you for listening to my presentation.